Kevin, thank you so much for hosting this forum today, for your constant willingness to engage on economic issues, tax issues, policy issues, fiscal, monetary ones, both at the Joint Economic Committee and the Ways and Means Committee as well. Thank you so much, and I appreciate the American Enterprise Institute hosting today's forum. They're involved in such key issues on Capitol Hill and abroad that it's a delight to be here today. And I also appreciate the panelists who are here, agreed to be part of the roundtable. Each of you bring tremendous experience, insight, and perspective to the Fed and the role it can play in the future. And so thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedules. Some say that the 19th century belongs to the Brits, the 20th century to the Americans, and the 21st century perhaps to the Chinese. Well, not so fast. The pessimists may see that direction, but I think while there are real challenges ahead, if we look to our economic future, Washington should have one goal, which is ensuring that America has the world's strongest economy throughout the 21st century. To ensure the 21st century is another American century, we have to renew our commitment to what works well, which is the free enterprise system, and what doesn't always work so well, which is the federal government. And in the context of building a strong economic future for the next 100 years, we have to thoughtfully and clearly define the role of the Federal Reserve. In my view, a sound dollar is the surest and strongest foundation for long-term economic growth. A sound dollar creates certainty, facilitates new business investment, and long-term job creation. Therefore, the focus of the Federal Reserve should be to protect the purchasing power of the dollar by maintaining price stability. Are there other fundamentals that America must get right to retain our economic standing in the 21st century? Absolutely. Congress and the President must also make our tax system simpler and more internationally competitive by lowering marginal tax rates, by moving to a modern territorial system, and ending the distortions within our tax code that pick winners and losers in the free market. Congress and the White House have to reform Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid to make each of them sustainably solvent. We have to transform our regulatory system into one where we can achieve our goals, including a clean environment and a safe workplace, but do it in a way that's efficient and balanced and less economically destructive as it moves forward. And we have to pursue trade agreements that open markets to allow our American companies and workers to sell throughout the world to the 95% of the consumers who live outside the United States, and do so in a way that we compete to win. However, these reforms by themselves will be insufficient if the Federal Reserve fails to maintain the purchasing power of the dollar over time. That's why we must first examine what monetary policy should be what it should be doing going forward. Economists broadly agree that the best way for a central bank to help maximize real economic growth and job creation is to maintain stable prices over time. One need only look to the Great Depression of the 1930s and the Great Inflation of the 1970s to see that both price deflation and price inflation are destructive. Both reduce real output and employment below what they would have otherwise been. Thus, the goal of monetary policy should be long-term price stability. In 1977, Congress mandated that the Federal Reserve pursue monetary policy, quote, so as to promote effectively the goals of maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates, unquote. Since inflationary expectations alter long-term interest rates, the goal of stable prices and moderate long-term interest rates are interrelated. This is why the Federal Reserve is described as having a dual mandate for both price stability and maximum employment. The employment half of the dual mandate, reflected in the Employment Act of 1946, required the federal government to pursue economic policies that, quote, promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power. The price stability half of the dual mandate reflected rising public concerns about price inflation in the 1970s. When thinking about the Federal Reserve's dual mandate, it's important to remember an observation made by Nobel laureate economist Robert Mundell. To achieve a policy outcome, you must use the right policy lever. In the Federal Open Markets Committee here recently, the statement of January 25, 2012, Chairman Ben Bernanke and the other members recognized that monetary policy is the right lever to maintain the purchasing power of the dollar. They declared the inflation rate over the longer run is primarily determined by monetary policy. In contrast, FOMC acknowledged that monetary policy is the wrong lever to promote job creation by declaring the maximum level of employment is largely determined by non-monetary factors. Congress delegates monetary policy to the Federal Reserve and should hold it accountable for its conduct of monetary policy. However, it makes no sense for Congress to charge the Federal Reserve to control what it cannot control. Except in the very short term, monetary policy can't boost real output and job creation. Instead, using monetary policy as a short-term tool to speed growth may actually harm the economy. Ultimately, it is the President and the Congress, not the Federal Reserve, that controls the budget, tax, and regulatory policies that create the business climate that drives economic growth and job creation. There is no substitute. And since Congress gave a dual mandate to the Federal Reserve, governments in many other countries have revised the charters of their central banks. In most cases, these governments gave their central bank either a single mandate for price stability, as we do, or a primary mandate for price stability, with other goals clearly subordinated. Among the 47 central banks and monetary authorities in major countries surveyed by the Bank of International Settlements, only the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve have organizational laws that give other goals equal weight to price stability. So how should the Fed pursue its mandate? According to Stanford University economist John Taylor, the choice is between a discretionary regime and a rules-based regime. A discretionary regime creates uncertainty because it relies upon the subjective assessments of central bank policymakers. In contrast, a rules-based regime reduces uncertainty because it follows well-established rules based on observable economic data with a clear focus on a long-term goal. Inflation targeting is a rules-based regime under which a central bank establishes a target inflation rate expressed in terms of a broad-based price index of goods and services. A central bank tightens monetary policy when the actual inflation rate rises above its target and loosens monetary policy when the actual inflation rate falls below its target. The last 4 decades of U.S. monetary policy demonstrates the advantages of a rules-based regime over a discretionary one. During the 1970s, the Federal Reserve had a go-stop policies in which monetary policy quickly swung from ease to tightness and back again. This incoherence produced a highly volatile real economy and rising inflation. A sea change occurred with the appointment of Paul Volcker as chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve in 1979. Under Chairman Volcker, the FOMC tackled price inflation by controlling the growth of the money supply. This successful strategy was a significant step toward a rules-based monetary policy. And while the economy did suffer back-to-back recessions from January 1980 to June 1980, and July to 1981 to November the next year, inflation, as measured by the Consumer Price Index, dropped dramatically from 13.3% in 1979, the year Chairman Volcker joined the Federal Reserve, to 3.8% in 1982. Between 1983 and 2000, the period known as the Great Moderation, the Federal Reserve pursued price stability through an increasingly rules-based monetary policy, effectively ignoring the second half of its mandate. 2 long economic booms resulted with very low inflation. The booms were interrupted only by a short, shallow recession related to the First Persian Gulf War. Between 2000 and 2005, the FOMC deviated from this successful rules-based regime, moving to a discretionary regime by keeping interest rates too low for too long. This loose monetary policy contributed to the inflation of an unsustainable housing bubble that eventually triggered a global financial crisis. Since the height of the financial crisis during the fall of 2008, Washington has increasingly relied on the Federal Reserve to take unusual interventionist actions, such as tripling the size of its balance sheet under QE1 and QE2 by purchasing the debt in the residential mortgage-backed securities issued by Fannie and Freddie, as well as Treasuries. Indeed, the Open Market Committee justified these extraordinary actions by invoking, for the first time since over in late 2008, the employment half of the Federal Reserve's dual mandate. Ultimately, the Open Markets Committee took these actions to compensate in part for President Obama's failure to pursue pro-growth budget, tax, and regulatory policies. And they may well continue because just as low borrowing costs are masking the pain of historically high federal budget deficits, the Federal Reserve's monetary experimentation continues to permit the White House and Congress to shirk their responsibility for creating a competitive business climate. The Federal Reserve's monetary experimentation of the last decade must end. Congress should give the Federal Reserve a single mandate for price stability, and the Federal Reserve should return to a rules-based system of inflation targeting to achieve that mandate. To provide the foundation for long-term economic growth in America, today I'm unveiling the Sound Dollar Act. It reforms the Federal Reserve in several important ways. Specifically, the Sound Dollar Act replaces the dual mandate with the single mandate for long-term price stability. It increases the Fed's accountability and openness. It diversifies the Federal Open Markets Committee. It ensures credit neutrality for future Fed purchases and institutes congressional oversight of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Critics of a single mandate often charge that focusing on a sound dollar implies the Federal Reserve will somehow ignore the employment needs of Americans. It's just the opposite. Americans can only maximize our real economic output with long-term price stability. Thus, protecting the purchasing power of the dollar provides the strongest foundation for lasting economic growth and job creation. A mandate for price stability gives the Federal Reserve the right goal, but does not alone ensure the Federal Reserve achieves price stability. That requires the Fed to move away from a discretionary regime and back toward a rules-based regime. In January 2012, the FOMC announced an inflation target of 2%, defined in terms of the price index for personal consumption expenditures. I strongly applaud Chairman Bernanke and the other members of the FOMC for this step toward a rules-based inflation targeting regime. However, this is merely a policy statement that can easily be reversed. Therefore, the Sound Dollar Act mandates that the Open Markets Committee continues inflation targeting. And as you know, accurately measuring inflation isn't easy. In the last decade, we clearly saw that price indices of goods and services don't always record all the price movements in our economy, allowing asset bubbles to inflate undetected. The Open Markets Committee's inflation target relies upon the price index for personal consumption expenditures. However, this index shouldn't be the sole indicator the Federal Reserve uses for measuring inflation. To identify incipient asset bubbles before they inflate to dangerous levels, the Sound Dollar Act requires that the Open Markets Committee also monitor the prices of and the returns on broad classes of assets, including equities, corporate bonds, state and local government bonds, agricultural real estate, commercial and industrial real estate, and residential real estate. It also insists that they monitor the price of gold and the foreign exchange value of the U.S. dollar. To be clear, the Sound Dollar Act doesn't prescribe any specific action that the Federal Reserve must take if it detects an asset bubble. The appropriate response is highly dependent upon the circumstances. These responses might include a tightening of monetary policy, supervisory dissuasion and regulatory actions to reduce the flow of credit to fund purchases of the asset. Discretion with respect to the best response should be left to the Open Markets Committee. However, identifying an asset price bubble early may help to avoid the overinvestment and the malinvestment that must eventually be liquidated at a heavy cost in terms of lower real output and lost jobs. Let's turn for a moment to the Federal Open Markets Committee. As important as they are, there is more to the U.S. economy than New York and Washington. To broaden input, to increase geographic diversity, and reduce the overwhelming influence of New York and Washington into the Open Markets Committee decision-making, the Sound Dollar Act grants a permanent seat on the FOMC to every regional Federal Reserve Bank president. Currently, only the governors and the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York have permanent seats. 4 of the remaining 11 presidents rotate on and off FOMC each year. Implementing this change restores the original intent of Congress to establish the Fed as representative of a broad cross-section of America's diverse economy. I'm also firmly committed to the independence of the Federal Reserve in conducting monetary policy. That's why I'm particularly troubled by the FOMC decision in September 2011 to reinvest the proceeds from maturing federal agency debt and RMBS into new federal agency RMBS instead of allowing these holdings to decline as originally intended. This policy reverse occurred amid intense pressure from special interest groups for federal action to support the ailing housing market. When the FOMC deals in securities other than treasuries, repurchase agreements and reverse repurchase agreements for the system open market account, the Federal Reserve is allocating credit among different sectors of our economy. Credit allocation exposes the Federal Reserve to political interference. To maintain the independence of the Federal Reserve and to ensure credit neutrality, the Sound Dollar Act requires the FOMC to deal only in treasuries, repos, and reverse repos for the system open market account unless the FOMC finds by a 2/3 vote that unusual and exigent circumstances exist. The FOMC could then purchase other securities for the system open market account so long as they are liquidated within 5 years after the unusual circumstances. Looking ahead to the next crisis, it's important to note that in its nearly century of existence, the Federal Reserve has never articulated its lender of last resort policy. Economist Alan Meltzer described the problems this void creates. The absence of a lender of last resort policy has 3 unfortunate consequences. First, uncertainty increases. No one can know what will be done. Second, troubled firms have a stronger incentive to seek a political solution. They ask Congress or the administration for support or to pressure the Federal Reserve or other agencies to save them from failure. And third, repeated rescues encourage banks to take greater risk and increase leverage. This is the well-known moral hazard problem. Each of these problems became manifest in 2008. To avoid these problems in the future, the Sound Dollar Act requires the Federal Reserve to publish its lender of last resort policy. Of course, we don't expect a precise tactical plan. As President Dwight D. Eisenhower observed, war plans never survive the first battle. Nevertheless, war planning is essential to victory. In the same way, while the Federal Reserve can't anticipate every nuance of the next financial crisis, publishing a lender of last resort policy will reduce future market uncertainty. Next, I want to applaud Chairman Bernanke for his steps to increase transparency in monetary policy decision-making, but there is an additional step that the Federal Reserve should take. The Sound Dollar Act speeds the release of transcripts of FOMC meetings from 5 years to 3 years. Some critics claim this acceleration would inhibit free discussion at FOMC meetings. If that is the case, then perhaps we need different FOMC members. A 3-year lag will also allow Congress to review these FOMC transcripts before a Fed chairman is reconfirmed, which is absent from the deliberations today. In another reform, the Sound Dollar Act eliminates a slush fund that's been abused by secretaries of the Treasury in both Democrats and Republican administrations. To prevent future abuses, my measure transforms the Exchange Stabilization Fund into a special drawing rights fund, liquidates all of the non-SDR assets over 3 years, and uses the proceeds to reduce federal debt. As you may remember, in 1934, Congress placed the profits from the nationalization of privately owned gold and the subsequent devaluation of U.S. dollar into the Exchange Stabilization Fund and authorized its use to intervene in foreign exchange markets to support fixed exchange rates. In 1968, Congress placed the special drawing rights issued by the International Monetary Fund into the Exchange Stabilization Fund. And after the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates collapsed in 1971, the Treasury has used the non-SDR assets in the fund for purposes that Congress never intended, such as bailing out Mexico in 1995 and guaranteeing money market mutual funds in 2008. The Sound Dollar Act ends this. Finally, the Dodd-Frank Act funded the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau by diverting the Federal Reserve's profits, which would otherwise be paid to the Treasury, and sent it to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau so that it could avoid congressional scrutiny. This is a dangerous precedent. Nothing other than the operating costs of the Federal Reserve should be paid for out of its profits. Thus, the Sound Dollar Act ends this diversion and requires that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau seek annual appropriations from Congress, just as other federal agencies do. In the end, there is no justification not to. So to conclude, it's appropriate that we have this discussion and debate about the Fed's role in the future of our economy. On this day in 1933, just 24 hours after he became president, Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered the banks closed, banned the export of gold to stop a growing panic as the Depression intensified, and called Congress back into special session. So this is a historic day and a reminder that we ought to focus on not the reactive results and actions of the Fed, but the strong proactive rules by which we want them to operate. To ensure America has thoughtfully prepared for the challenges ahead, the Sound Dollar Act proposes the best path to help the United States retain its economic preeminence by preserving the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar. It does so by giving the Federal Reserve a single mandate for price stability and strengthening the Fed's independence, even as the Act increases the Fed's accountability. These reforms, I believe, are critical to ensuring that the 21st century is indeed another American century. With that, thank you.